Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 788, and today is April 21st, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. So, long weekend here. I hope everybody had a good Easter or 420, whatever you ended up celebrating, that you had some nice time with family, friends, and a nice, relaxing, and hopefully long weekend. Wasn't necessarily a long weekend for me. I did a bunch of writing for antiwar.com, so I'm going to jump into those articles pretty quickly. Just want to remind people to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. Like all the articles we're talking about today can be found on antiwar.com. The show's always on the blog, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. And of course, it's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcast. Let's get into it. All right, so first up here, this is a story that I wrote that I think has gotten the least amount of attention, but I think it's the most important, actually. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it. Congressman visits Ukraine front lines, signs shell to Putin. So Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick claimed he traveled to Ukraine and spent several days traveling around the front lines. As a photo op, the Pennsylvania Republican signed an artillery shell to Putin. According to the Philadelphia Inquirer, Rep. Fitzpatrick spent a week visiting Ukraine's frontline soldiers. The congressman wrote on X, "It was my profound honor to deliver a personal message to Vladimir Putin today from the front lines of the war near the Russian border. On behalf of our PA1 community, Pennsylvania 1st Congressional District community, the only permissible details to share that are the message was delivered on target." And so he's saying that he wrote this shell while he was on the front lines, and then within a relatively short period of time, it was fired at Russian soldiers. So a photo posted to X shows Fitzpatrick wrote, "To Putin" on an artillery shell. A video shows the congressman firing a large weapon, although it's unclear if this occurred on the front lines. In a second video, Fitzpatrick said he was traveling around the front lines and was wearing a bag that appeared to contain small arms ammunition. Fitzpatrick traveled to the front lines with Ukraine's National Guard Artillery and 3rd Assault Brigade. The 3rd Assault Brigade is made up of Azov Special Operations soldiers and is commanded by Andrei Belitsky. Belitsky is the founder of the Azov movement and is a white supremacist and neo-Nazi. He previously declared himself a white ruler. His vision for Ukraine includes dissolving the country's democracy and capitalist economy in favor of National Socialism. The 3rd Assault Brigade commander stated the goal is leading the white races of the world in a final crusade against the Semitic-led Untermenschen. During his time in Ukraine, Fitzpatrick said that he had come under Russian drone fire, forcing emergency evacuation. He went on to call other members of Congress to visit the Ukrainian front lines. In a separate post, he said he met with Ukrainian officials to discuss how he could help advance critical legislative efforts in support of Ukraine. The Republican congressman added, "We discussed strengthening the U.S.-Ukrainian cooperation, backing the American Peace Initiative, and the enduring principle of peace through strength." Fitzpatrick has emerged as one of the most vocal supporters of Ukraine in the Congress. Before getting elected to the House in 2017, he had worked for the FBI, including posts in Kiev. He co-chairs the Ukraine caucus in the House. And so, just really want to emphasize here that there is a congressman, an American congressman, one of our elected members of the House of Representatives, traveling around on the front lines of Russia, clearly carrying ammunition, around ammunition, firing weaponry, right? Like, all of this is extremely provocative. He says he's coming under Russian drone fire at times. This is extremely dangerous, extremely stupid, could lead to a massive escalation. And if it doesn't do that, it's just a huge sign of how far we have come and how much support the Ukrainians are getting, that we have frontline soldiers doing. I mean, I can't imagine, an American congressman going and touring around and helping the IDF like load rounds and stuff like that. But that's what we have going on here. This is major. I mean, we have seen like Congressman Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, and other U.S. politicians go and sign artillery shells in Israel, but that never appeared to be like on the front lines to me or in any way a combat related situation. If this guy had gone to Kiev and visited some arms depot and just signed a couple weapons, I don't think that would have been, it would have been a propaganda stunt. It would have been stupid, but it wouldn't have been this provocative and this dangerous. And so I think this is a really big deal. And especially as he was traveling around with the Azov battalion, a bunch of white nationalists, neo-Nazi supremacists. It's amazing, right? That for essentially a decade now in this country, since Donald Trump, which I guess was about 10 years ago now, first announced his political candidacy, there's essentially been hyperventilating among the American political class and media elites that we are on the verge of being taken over by white supremacists, and that, white supremacists have such a massive role in this country. But when you look at where we are actually tied to white supremacists, I mean, the most obvious place is Ukraine. And yet here we have a congressman that's going around hanging out with the Azov brigade, signing shells to Putin around the front lines as they're being fired. And this isn't invoking widespread condemnation and concerns about white supremacy. Just disgusting how incompetent our media is. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for antiwar.com on Friday, April 18th. Rubio, U.S. to decide within days if Ukraine peace deal is possible. So Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that President Donald Trump will decide if ending the war in Ukraine is possible sometime in the coming days. Rubio told reporters in Paris, "We're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end. So we need to determine very quickly now, and I'm talking about in a matter of days, whether or not this is doable in the next few weeks." President Trump made ending the war in Ukraine one of his top campaign priorities. Since taking office in January, his staff has engaged in several rounds of high-level talks with Russian and Ukrainian officials. Rubio said, "The president feels very strongly about that. He has dedicated a lot of time and energy to this. This is important, but there's a lot of other really important things going on that just deserve just as much, if not more attention." Now, the problem here is the state of the U.S.-Russian relationship at the time when Trump took office was at its lowest, maybe historically. I mean, certainly since the end of the Cold War, but even going back to most points in the Cold War. I mean, the Biden administration was assessing there was a 50% chance that Russia could use a nuclear weapon. Biden said most dangerous time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were right on the verge of direct, U.S. and killing Russian soldiers kind of warfare in Ukraine under the Biden administration. But on top of that, there is no diplomatic contact between the two countries nearly at all. And so the idea that we're going to not only reestablish diplomatic contact and restart negotiations and just general talks and relationship with Russia, but that we're going to do that and end the war in Ukraine in a matter of weeks is simply absurd. And you wonder, and I don't think Marco Rubio is necessarily this smart, but if Marco Rubio was a smart man, right? If Marco Rubio was a Ted Cruz, say, because I do think Ted Cruz is a smart man, it would seem that he was maybe doing this intentionally, setting unrealistic expectations for ending the war in Ukraine, while seeming to be engaged, while seeming to want to make a deal. If he's saying that, well, Russia's just not doing it fast enough, this may convince Trump that we just don't have the time to spend on this. And if Russia really wanted a deal, they would have agreed to a deal already. And I think this is one of the ways that Rubio is trying to kill the talks between the U.S. and Russia, is again by saying these unrealistic expectations. Restoring the U.S. diplomatic and U.S. and Russian diplomatic relationship is something that's going to take time, and that relationship is key for ending the war in Ukraine. And sure, I would have loved to see the war in Ukraine end in 24 hours like Trump promised on the campaign trail. But this is going to be a complicated deal. It's going to take time to work out. And it's going to require the US and Russian officials to trust each other. And trust is built off of showing that we're going to agree to things and those things are going to be done. And it's going to be incremental. It's going to take time. But it needs to happen. And so saying that this needs to be done within days is, I think, effectively saying that it's not going to be done in a way that's acceptable to Russia. So the Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, who is leading the American negotiations, told Fox News host Sean Hannity that talks with Russia were progressing well. In an interview that aired on Monday, he explained this would be 1 week ago today. This is the third meeting that I've had with Putin. This last meeting lasted close to 5 hours. It was a compelling meeting, and towards the end, we actually came up with a path to permanent peace. However, Trump and Rubio have stated that Russia is not moving quickly enough in the diplomatic process. The President and Secretary of State have both threatened new sanctions on Russia in recent weeks if the Kremlin does not agree to a deal to end the conflict very soon. Moscow appears to be unwilling to accelerate the pace of talks on ending the war in Ukraine. Earlier this week, the Kremlin spokesman, that's Dmitry Peskov, said the issue was complex, so complex that it's unrealistic to expect immediate results. And I had to agree with Peskov on this, that when you look at the situation, not only on Ukraine, where you're talking about 1,000-mile front lines and, very complicated on where the new Russian territory, Russian border is, Ukrainian border is, and, what kind of demilitarization Ukraine is going to have to agree to, no NATO membership in the future, maybe restrictions on where Russia deploys or how closely Russia deploys troops, how closely they are to the Ukrainian border, right? These kind of things are going to be a part of the deal, but that's going to take time. This is a complex agreement. It is not going to happen just, forget saying overnight in 24 hours. At this point, it seems like months is a realistic expectation. Maybe in the fall, of course, things on the ground could change. The Ukrainians could become very, very needed to negotiate right away, and that could accelerate the talks. But I think, if we're going to work out a peace where the Ukrainians really end up with a say-so, that is going to take some time for the two sides and the Americans mediating to really hammer out the agreement. So, following the U.S. invasion of Ukraine in 2022, U.S.-Russian relations sank to a historic low point, with almost no contact between Washington and Russia during that period. Early rounds of talks between U.S. and Russian officials focused on returning to a normal diplomatic relationship. While Trump and Rubio has placed the blame on Moscow for the lack of progress towards a peace deal, Ukrainian President Zelensky has publicly declared that Kiev would not surrender any territory to bring an end to the war. Additionally, Kiev is moving closer to signing a deal with Washington to recapture some of the American money spent on Ukraine aid by seizing profits from Ukrainian oil, gas, and sales of oil, gas, and rare earth minerals. A top Ukrainian official said a memorandum of intent was signed on Thursday, and the deal is expected to be inked next week. It's unclear if the arrangement includes any security guarantees for Ukraine, but Rubio told reporters the issue came up during his talks in Paris. And so, definitely need to keep an eye on this. It seems there's a real opportunity for the Hots and the Trump administration to foil his planned diplomacy and end the war in Ukraine. So next up here, with an eye on Iran, U.S. sends bunker-busting bombs to Israel. Wrote this one on 420 for the antiwar.com. So 9 plane loads of bunker-busting bombs were shipped from the U.S. to Israel. The munitions are intended to prepare Israel for a potential war with Iran. This was a report from the Israeli Broadcasting Authority, Khan. 9 U.S. transport planes carrying bunker-busting bombs and other defensive weapons landed at the Navatin Air Base in Tel Aviv in central Israel. So the report noted that Washington also sent additional interceptors for the THAAD air defense system to Tel Aviv. The munitions and interceptors would be key to Israel attacking Iran's nuclear program, then countering the predictable Iranian response. Khan explained that the massive weapon shipment comes in anticipation of a possible joint U.S.-Israeli strike should nuclear negotiations between Washington and Tehran fail. And so I want to make it clear here that I think there is a possibility that this is Trump doing what he thinks is the art of the deal. I'm not saying it's smart. I'm not saying that this is a good negotiating strategy, but I do think it's possible that this is what Trump's doing here, trying to roll out his typical negotiating strategy where he wants to negotiate with somebody who's on their knees, who's begging and pleading him to make a deal. He wants the Ayatollah to come and say, Mr. Trump, please do not attack me. We will give up all of our weapons, all of our missiles, all of our nuclear reactors, right? That's what Donald Trump wants. He wants the other side completely subjugated to the American whims. Of course, that doesn't happen in geopolitics, which is why Trump is never able to get a deal done, because he always wants like these maximalist ends that are just never going to happen. And so it's possible that Trump actually doesn't think this is preparing for a military strike on Iran. He thinks this is making the Iranians shaking their boots and get so scared that the Israelis are going to launch a strike. Now, I think that could happen. And I think this is where Trump bats himself into really bad corners, where if you give Israel all these munitions, all these interceptors, then Netanyahu may just say, I know Trump hasn't said yes, but I'm going to do it because I have all the weapons. And I know at the end of the day, the Americans are going to help Israel shoot down the Iranian missiles that are fired back at Israel after a strike on Iran. And so even if Trump isn't necessarily doing this in a plot to attack Iran, it certainly could end up leading to that anyways. So under President Trump, a U.S.-supported Israeli strike on Iran has become increasingly likely. The administration is divided on whether to attempt to make a new nuclear pact with Tehran or forgo diplomacy and attack Iran's nuclear program. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is also lobbying Trump to aid an Israeli strike on Iran. Tel Aviv would need significant support from Washington to carry out a major strike on Iran's nuclear program. The New York Times reported on Wednesday that Netanyahu had requested Trump's assistance in a series of military operations aimed at Tehran. The Times said the American president had denied the Israeli leader's request. However, on Thursday, Trump explained that he had not ruled out attacking Iran, just said, I'm not in a rush to do it. The U.S. and Iran are currently engaged in indirect talks aimed at creating a new nuclear agreement. In 2015, Tehran agreed to additional limitations and inspections on its civilian program in exchange for sanctions relief. In 2018, Trump withdrew from that agreement. While in office, President Joe Biden engaged in some talks with Tehran in an effort to restore the Obama-era nuclear deal. Israel was able to sabotage the diplomacy with a series of assassinations and other attacks inside of Iran. Trump has now re-engaged with the Iranian government. While U.S. and Iranian officials appear optimistic after 2 rounds of talks, Trump has pushed for negotiations to move faster. And I think similar situation to the Russian negotiations we were just talking about. Trump should be prepared for this to be a multi-year process, for this to take a lot of time, but that is what would make this deal strong and able to be successful. So Israel will also need assistance in repelling any Iranian retaliatory attack. The U.S. currently has multiple THAAD and Patriot missile systems deployed to Israel. Now, last thing I want to note here is, the potential, I guess, for these bunker busters and for this shipment of weapons to be interpreted as a threat by Iran. And the Iranians have tried to be careful about not negotiating with the Americans in the response to a Trump threat. And I think this is probably a wise decision because Trump tends to build on his perceived successes. And so the Iranians are like, oh no, we're so scared of the Americans, we're going to come to the table and talk and make a new nuclear deal. Then Trump isn't going to say, oh, well, I got what I wanted. He's going to say, how can I crank up the pressure to get more? All right, so let's talk about those talks. U.S. Iran holds second round of talks, agree to a third. I wrote this one again on antiwar.com on 420. U.S. and Iranian officials engaged in talks over the weekend in Rome and agreed to more talks later in the week. President Donald Trump said he is only willing to engage with Tehran for a short period before a deal has to be signed, or the U.S. will attack Iran with Israel. The second round of talks was held in Italy on Saturday, a week after the initial talks in Oman. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman said that the talks were indirect. An unnamed American official said the talks were advancing towards a deal. So a U.S. official told CBS News, "Today in Rome, over 4 hours in our second round of talks, we made very good progress in our direct and indirect discussions. We agreed to meet again next week and are grateful to our Omani partners for facilitating these talks and our Italian partners for hosting us today." The Iranian foreign minister also described the talks as positive. He said, "The talks were held in a constructive environment, and I can say that this is moving forward. I hope that we will be in a better position after the technical talks." A third round of talks is scheduled to begin in Oman on Wednesday. The two sides are preparing to engage in lower level or working level talks, which they are describing as technical discussions. The Iranian foreign minister said a higher level talks would resume next Saturday. I believe those are again going to be in Oman. The Trump administration says its top issue in the talks is preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. However, the U.S. intelligence community admits that Tehran is not seeking to weaponize its civilian nuclear energy program. Still, some members of the Trump administration are arguing that the Islamic Republic is in a weakened position, giving the U.S. and Israel a unique opportunity to take out the Iranian civilian nuclear program by force. Tehran appears to be attempting to reach a similar deal to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal that Trump unilaterally exited from 7 years ago. Under that agreement, Iran agreed to additional limits and inspections of its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief from Washington and its allies. At times, Trump has appeared receptive to this form of deal. He said, "I'm for stopping Iran very simply from having a nuclear weapon. I want Iran to be great and prosperous and terrific." However, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, along with some members of the Trump administration, have demanded the Islamic Republic go further and completely dismantle its nuclear program and uranium enrichment capabilities. The New York Times reported last week that Netanyahu has pushed for an attack on Iran, but Trump pushed back on the idea. On Saturday, Reuters spoke with Israeli officials who said Tel Aviv was still considering a strike on Iran, even without Trump's endorsement. An Iranian official said Tehran was aware Tel Aviv was planning an attack. "We have intelligence from reliable sources that say Israel is planning a major attack on Iran's nuclear sites. This stems from dissatisfaction with the ongoing diplomatic effort regarding Iran's nuclear program, and also from Netanyahu's need for conflict as a means of political survival." And so at least the Iranians do understand the Israeli motives and Netanyahu, which is important. This is one of the things I would really fault Trump on, and American leadership in general. This was even true under the, Biden administration when it comes to Russia, that we really just don't understand leaders of foreign countries, what they want, what their motivations are. We just assign motivations to them, like Iran's trying to build a nuclear weapon, and then we force Iran to sign a nuclear deal to prevent them from building a nuclear weapon when they never wanted to build a nuclear weapon in the first place. And if it wasn't for all the antagonism and assassinations and sabotage and this, asymmetrical warfare that Washington and Tel Aviv wage against Iran, then I'm sure Iran would be far more receptive to different kinds of nuclear deals. So while talks are progressing, Trump has demanded negotiations move forward at a rapid pace. It is unclear if Tehran is willing to move fast enough to keep Trump from electing to move to the military option. And a potential deal has been endorsed by some nations in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia. Last week, high-ranking officials from the kingdom traveled to Iran for talks on improving ties. Additionally, Riyadh said an agreement would enhance, agreement between the U.S. and Iran would enhance peace in the region and the world. So that's a pretty good endorsement. All right. Next up here, this one from Connor Freeman at antiwar.com. The Department of Homeland Security revokes visas of over 1,500 students, none charged with any crimes. So in recent weeks, more than 1,500 international graduate and undergraduate students from over 240 colleges have had their J1 or F1 visas revoked by Washington without notifying the students or their respective universities. The revocations mean the students will not be permitted to finish their studies in person and will have to return to their home countries. So these are just two visas. One is for research scholars and cultural exchange visitors intended for people doing business or medical training, or another one is for students from other countries, which allows them to pursue their education at American universities. Let's see. The school became aware of these changes of the students' legal statuses by checking international student record systems contained in the Department of Homeland Security's Student Exchange Information System, or CVIS. Middle East Eye report that at least 3 universities received no prior notice about the visa's cancellations and were not informed of any reasons for their students' legal status termination. And of course, this is all about Israel. This is all about censorship, controlling the narrative, and shutting down free speech and the First Amendment on college campuses. At least the free speech and First Amendment when it comes to the state of Israel. All right, next up here, Israel report concludes professional failures led to IDF murdering 15 Palestinian medics. So an inquiry by the Israeli Defense Forces into its soldiers murdering 15 Palestinian medics in Rafah last month dismissed its forces opening fire on the first responders. The report by the IDF found professional failures and operational misunderstandings were the cause of Israeli soldiers killing 15 Palestinian medics. It concluded that troops opened fire on the ambulances after perceiving an immediate and tangible threat. On March 23rd, IDF soldiers in Rafah opened fire on a convoy of ambulances. Initially, Tel Aviv claimed that the vehicles were driving erratically and without their lights on. However, a video from one of the medics' phones showed that the ambulances were driving with caution and using their sirens. After the massacre of the medics, most of whom worked for the Red Crescent, the IDF buried the victims and their vehicles in a mass grave. Once the crime scene was exhumed, autopsies showed most of the first responders were killed to bullets to the head or chest. The report claimed that the mass grave was not an effort for the IDF, was not an effort at an IDF cover-up. So the IDF asserted there is no attempt to conceal the event, which was discussed with international organizations and the UN, including Coordination for the Removal of Bodies. Breaking the silence, an organization of IDF veterans called the report a cover-up, and this is what their statement said. The investigation is riddled with contradictions and vague phrasings and selective details. The only serious disciplinary action taken, the dismissal of a deputy commander of Golani's elite unit. His reported failure was submitting an incomplete account of the incident. In other words, he lied. We all remember the IDF claimed that the ambulance's emergency lights weren't on, and then we saw footage proving otherwise. Not every lie has a video to expose it, but this report doesn't even engage with the truth. Over the past 18 months, the IDF has committed countless atrocities in Gaza. Most of the time, the mass killing of Palestinians by Israelis goes unreported in Western media. However, on a few occasions, IDF operations have come under scrutiny in the U.S. Tel Aviv has skirted any responsibility for the war crimes by investigating its forces and including there were errors made, but no intentional or systematic wrongdoing. All right. And then I am going to wrap up today's show with this last article I wrote for the antiwar.com. Israeli attacks kill over 100 Gazans in 72 hours. So since Friday, Israeli strikes across the Gaza Strip have killed well over 100 Palestinians as the IDF continues to pound tents where displaced Palestinians are sheltering. On Saturday, the Gaza Health Ministry reported 92 Palestinians were killed over the past 2 days. The ministry only records the death of Palestinians if the bodies are brought to hospitals and morgues. On Sunday, Gaza Civil Defense reported an additional 25 deaths. The dead include 15 children who were sheltering in tents near Khan Yunis when an Israeli strike killed them. Reporting on the strike, Al Jazeera's Tariq Abu Zamum explained, for the vast majority of civilians, nighttime is a time of horror and unrelenting pain. Nobody is safe in their homes, in their makeshift tents, in displacement camps. A separate attack on a civilian gathering killed 5. In mid-March, Israel broke a ceasefire and hostage deal with Hamas by resuming major military operations in the Strip. Over 1,700 Palestinians have been killed by Israel since March 18th. The death toll since October 7th, 2023 is now over 51,000. Some Israeli officials are saying that the goal of the military operations in Gaza is the expulsion of Palestinians. Last week, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich called for the military to, quote, open the gates of hell, which I guess they would just see Bezalel Smotrich there anyway, and expel the Palestinians from Gaza. The official death reported by the health ministry are considered a significant undercount, as it does not include the thousands of Palestinians laying dead beneath the rubble in Gaza. On Friday, the Gazan health official confirmed the death of photojournalist Fatema Hazamu to CNN. She had a major role in a documentary that will make its debut at the Cannes Film Festival. And that's likely what got her killed, by the way. You know, we've seen Israel do this when Palestinians in Gaza gain some kind of notoriety, particularly the journalists, they then get murdered. Before her death, she said, if I die, I want it to be a loud death. I don't want to just be breaking news or a number in a group. I want it to be a death the world will hear, an impact that will remain through time, and timeless image that cannot be buried by time or place. And certainly it's, something like that is needed to break through what has happened in Gaza and just the general American ambivalence that our weapons are enabling a genocide there. So over 200 journalists, I think by some counts, I have read like 150. Then I read another Palestinian source that had the number at 210. I think the Gaza's media office has the number in like the 230s or 240s now. But definitely over 200 journalists have been killed by Israel since October 7th Hamas attack. Aside from the constant threat of Israeli bombs, Palestinians are also increasingly facing starvation. So this is from Oxfam. Kids are eating less than a meal a day and struggling to find their next meal. Malnutrition and pockets of famine are definitely occurring in Gaza. Hamas again offered to release all hostages if Israel would end military operations in Gaza, but Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said they cannot accept the offer. His quote was, "We are at a critical stage of the campaign, and at this point, we need patience and determination to win." And what he means by that is we need to keep the work going. All right, everybody, that'll wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Don't forget, we will be back with another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show today. They come out every Monday and Wednesday live at 4:45 Eastern Time. Today, I will be interviewing Ambassador Ian Proud. So be sure to subscribe and to check that out. Thanks, everyone, and we'll be back with more shows soon.